Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Mailbox for the 23rd of April 2014. My name is TotalBiscuit, with the return of the viewer Q&A. You can email in mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, that's mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, with topics for future shows. The game in the background is FTL Captain's Edition. Frankly, it should be renamed FTL Prepare to Die, although I think that applies to the previous version too. First email comes in from Darren McGrory that says, do you think the genre of PewDieBait games is detrimental to the games industry, or do you think the games industry can expand and diversify to accommodate it without compromising other titles? What does he mean by PewDieBait, you might ask? Well, it actually refers to a term that I coined when I was doing my video of Goat Simulator, where I made the accusation of the title that games and other games like that were specifically designed for YouTube success and to appeal to very large YouTube channels that have a tendency to create content based on wacky nonsense and screaming and overacting, which, you know, of course would be PewDiePie in a nutshell there. And appealing to a channel like PewDiePie is a fairly important thing to do, considering that any video he makes will get multiple millions of views, and this can be used for good or ill. Sometimes it's used for good, it promotes very good games. Sometimes it's used for ill, it promotes absolute tat like Goat Simulator. But I don't think PewDieBait is a genre yet. I don't think that is something that you can go out of your way to say, oh, look at how this is becoming a genre in and of itself. I think that there are certain games which have taken into account the fact that YouTube has become a very powerful medium, that Let's Play has become a very popular form of entertainment, and as a result, certain elements of games have been modified to take into account the possibility of Let's Play. Indeed, you could maybe even argue that the rise of procedural generation and randomly generated content, indeed maybe even more permadeath, actually might have something to do with that. I don't think it's a dominant factor, but I have a feeling that it comes into the mind of people that are trying to create these kind of games. Outside of Goat Simulator, I don't think there's been anything that's flagrantly YouTube when it comes to video games. You could say Happy Wheels is, but at the end of the day, the developer of games like QWOP didn't make it specifically for YouTube. The developer of Happy Wheels didn't make it specifically for YouTube. The developer of Slender didn't make their game specifically for YouTube. And certainly the developers of games like Amnesia did not make that game specifically for YouTube. The scarecam trend did jump off the back of Amnesia and Slender, there's no doubt about that, but those games weren't designed that way. And was there an explosion of games that were afterwards? Yes. Were most of those games, at least on PC, free? Also, yes. I don't necessarily think there is currently a trend towards creating games that are purely Let's Play bait. I think if we had a sudden explosion of Wacky Sandbox Simulator, which is loaded with memes and a bunch of references to people that you wouldn't know unless you happen to be a frequent Twitch user, then we might have a problem, but I don't necessarily think that is going to happen. There will certainly be some imitators of Goat Simulator because it was highly successful, and let's be honest, if you manage to make a highly successful title on a bare minimum budget, which is deliberately designed to be bad, you are going to have some imitators, but the question is, for how long? And will that actually become a prominent genre? It probably won't. What I think will happen, though, especially as we continue to go through PC development, and even on PS4 and Xbox One, now that you can stream there, as well as upload to YouTube, of course, is that there will be certain elements of games that are designed in a way that makes them easier to watch, or indeed, just more enjoyable to watch. It is possible that there will be pandering to the Let's Play crowd. That may involve perhaps more ridiculous scenes, more big surprises, or maybe it just means that the genres that are getting created lean towards the idea of longer Let's Play series and maybe move away from the notion of having these cutscene-heavy titles that are very reliant on story, because let's be honest, Let's Play can absolutely ruin the story, or indeed the experience of playing a game, and a lot of people don't even want to play these story-driven games anymore. They would much rather just watch their favorite personality play it. And I think it's less about pewdification in the sense of making wacky, silly games that you can scarecam through, and more about the idea that Let's Play isn't going away. It obviously has a very large audience, and the size of Let's Play may very well cause developers to rethink the way that they tell their story. There are positives and negatives attached to that. The positives are that we might end up seeing a resurgence of genres. In fact, one could argue that we already are, that are based around the personal experience and not around telling a preset story to you. Whether that be roguelike titles, whether that be simulators, whether that be city builders, sandbox construction games in the vein of Minecraft. You can talk about Goat Simulator all you please, but if you want to talk about a game that really launched a genre and that YouTube was primarily responsible for popularizing, you talk about Minecraft. That's a game that many have tried to imitate, has created its own genre. I mean, it's gone to the point where Sony Online Entertainment has taken lessons from Minecraft, a small Swedish indie game, to create their next EverQuest title. I mean, come on, one of the most famous MMO properties of all time is taking cues from Minecraft. And it's those sandbox games that can create huge series. There's entire channels based upon them that have been doing the same thing for years, and it doesn't get boring. Whereas your standard game just gets Let's Played, is finished in 10 to 20 episodes, and that's that. So I feel there's going to be more of that going on, and it's already happening at this point, and I think that that can be a real positive, because I would prefer that most games move away from the traditional method of storytelling, because I sincerely do not believe that it works in an interactive medium, and I think it's doing a disservice to the interactive medium as well as shutting your player out unnecessarily. I play games to play, to make choices, to feel that I am part of the story, not that I am a spectator looking in through the window, which is what I often experience in AAA titles. More games that focus on the idea of creating your own story, as far as I'm concerned, are a positive to the scene. Unfortunately, the negative side of things is that games that really do have a good story to tell may very well end up selling less copies as a result of Let's Play, and we might see these games moving away from this kind of storytelling. And in some scenarios, it works fairly well. I personally dislike games like Gone Home and Dear Esther, but a lot of people do like them, and I have to wonder if developers will continue to make games like that when they're almost so easily spoiled by someone with a webcam and a headset sitting down and talking over it. So I do believe there are positives and negatives. I think, honestly, the positives do outweigh the negatives, however. I think instead of talking about putification, we should probably talk about the idea that games are now having to incorporate the notion that lots of people want to spectate the experience. And that could be a positive. We're just gonna have to wait and see. Next email comes in from MVH that says, do you ever feel bad for giving a bad or horrible review for a game, especially when it's an indie developer and the criticism is against maybe just a couple of people? Yes. Does that stop me from doing it? No. Why? Because my first duty as a game critic, reviewer, previewer, first impressions, commentator guy, whatever the hell you want to call me, is to the consumer, it's not to the developer. I think that as someone that has an awful lot of influence, you've got to be extremely careful. And when it comes to accuracy, you've got to make sure that you don't make any glaring errors that actually makes the game look worse. There are a number of different ways that that can happen. One is simply by making a factual error. The second, perhaps the more insidious one that we do actually see from a number of Let's Players, more so than we do from people that actually try and do critiques or first impressions or anything, is the idea of allowing your lack of skill to get in the way and then blaming the game for your own mistakes. There are certain scenarios where games are to blame for your mistakes. Either the game did a terrible job of explaining a particular concept, which is a legitimate criticism, although it is also a criticism that you should be able to identify. You should be able to say, look, I do not believe the game properly explained this particular mechanic, and that's a problem. Or it can come down to the idea that a game is just flat out unfair, which is certainly not uncommon. I think that it's perhaps even more common lately with games that are needlessly hard just for no apparent reason, because I believe there seems to be a desire to have that difficulty level there. But you can still mess up in a big way. If you screw something up and it's your fault, then that can reflect very poorly on the title, and you've got to be really careful about that. A recent mistake that I made was about the story of The Last Federation. That was a weird one because it was actually a legitimate piece of feedback. I expressed confusion at the story of that game, where the Hydral race, even though they were the only spacefaring race, was somehow wiped out by space-based weaponry, which made very little sense to me. Now, the game itself doesn't tell you how that actually happened. The intro movie, which is only on YouTube and not in the game itself, that told you how it actually happened. So, in that case, we're kind of both wrong. I was wrong in my criticism of the story, but the game didn't actually show me the story in the first place. So we both have that kind of level of responsibility there. The thing is, the story not really making any sense in that respect doesn't actually make a lot of difference. It's not actually that important. I talk mostly about mechanics. Story is of limited value to me, and in a game like that, you're really creating your own story every time you play it, so the legitimacy of any kind of story criticism that I had would have been unimportant for the most part. And really, that's not going to stop too many people from buying the game. If I'd criticized the mechanics and I was wrong about those, then that would have been a factor. Still, could I be kinder when dealing with certain titles? Absolutely, yeah. I could have not completely crapped all over Uprising 44, but the game is also terrible. And I think that when your facts are correct, you can, at that point, really express them in whatever way you see fit. And while it's a lot easier to criticize a AAA, because really, what difference is it gonna make? It's still gonna sell millions of copies, they're still gonna be absolutely fine, so, you know, do I feel guilty about criticizing BioShock Infinite after Irrational Games shut down? No, because I wasn't the reason for that. It sold millions and millions of copies. It was ridiculously successful. Irrational Games got shut down for entirely different reasons. Have I seen an indie dev shut down as a result of a video that I've done? Not to the best of my knowledge, anyway. But here's the thing, and this is what you've got to view as really important. The consumer is the one who is most likely losing the most out of this. People don't have the money to buy hundreds of games every month. I mean, that's ludicrous. And while games have not really been going up in price, let's be frank, we're still not in a great economic situation, especially not in the US or the UK. People don't have that much disposable income, and they also have very limited time, so I'd rather be saving those people money where possible, and I view that as more important. As long as I'm honest about things, I don't have a problem with criticizing a game, even if it is maybe hurtful to the developer, because they're the ones that put it on sale in the first place. I think if you start asking for money for things, you say, hey, pay me $20 for this product, then you open yourself up to that kind of stuff, and people have to provide that, because if they don't, then consumers get taken in time and again, and I'm sorry, but I don't believe in caveat emptor. I think that's absolute nonsense. I've never believed in caveat emptor. I believe that publishers and developers and the people that make products have a certain level of responsibility, and the law reflects that, I might add. I don't know why it is that so many gamers and consumers seem okay with the idea of caveat emptor. I do believe it's actually just to feel superior. They want to be snarky. They want to feel like they're better and smarter than other people. And that is the only reason they would be in favor of something like caveat emptor, for personal petty reasons, which, as far as I'm concerned, are not legitimate reasons. I believe that these developers should be held accountable, and I also believe that if you make a bad game and you try and sell it, then you deserve to be criticized for that. Yeah, it sucks when you have to do it to an indie developer. You know it's only a few guys making this game, and I try and be as fair as possible. And I think it's just the fairness that really matters. As long as the criticism is fair, how harsh it is really isn't relevant. Yeah, of course, there are real people behind that, but I don't think I've ever really got to the point of outright insulting people on a personal level, and if you can't take criticism of your product, then don't try and sell your product. And the last question comes in from Onan that says, what's the point in so many games calling themselves roguelike these days? Games like FTL and Spelunky are so far removed from the original game Rogue that the term just loses all meaning. Rogue and the original roguelikes hinged on the distinct combination of permadeath, turn-based RPG, random generation, and extreme complexity. Taking any of these elements away stops it from being a roguelike. Sure, shorthand terms are useful for concise explanations, but it comes to the point where it's a roguelike doesn't tell me anything. Some modern roguelikes don't have permadeath or don't use procedural generation. The vast majority don't use turn-based combat and don't have very complex system interactions. What do Risk of Rain and Don't Starve have in common that they can share the genre of roguelike? I, for the most part, agree with that. I don't think that you necessarily have to have a ridiculous level of complexity in order to make a roguelike. I mean, if I go back to the roguelikes that I used to play when I was a lot younger, I would talk about a game like Angband. That was most assuredly a roguelike. No real doubt about that, but it wasn't that complex. And really, it was a game about pick a class, go into a dungeon, fight, get items, go further into the dungeon, and try not to die. There weren't actually that many complex interactions in that game. The mechanics were not that crazy. I also think it's entirely legitimate for games like, say, Dungeons of Dreadmore to be called roguelikes, because they do share the characteristics of a roguelike. They are a lot simpler than some roguelikes. Not all, you know, not every roguelike is very complex, but Dungeons of Dreadmore is very clearly a roguelike. The thing about roguelike is that it is a very specific genre that was established over 20 years ago, and you can't really apply it to games that don't fit into that kind of thing. And I fundamentally disagree with something like Risk of Rain being called a roguelike. I disagree with Don't Starve being called a roguelike. They are games that have roguelike elements. I think roguelite is a particularly good term. Roguelike-like is clumsy. Procedural Death Labyrinth is nonsensical and doesn't even apply to a lot of the games that are in that particular genre. Would you say that Don't Starve and Risk of Rain would fit into Procedural Death Labyrinth? No. That's why I don't think it's a particularly good term. I think that people are just attracted to it because it's kind of funny. However, genres do evolve, and they evolve from certain places. First-person shooter was not a genre for quite some time. It was actually a genre that never really started to gain any traction until around 1996, yeah? First-person shooter only really passed the term Doom clone in 1998, when it became clear that calling something an X-clone was not good enough. It wasn't a good genre description. And as a result, Doom clone is pretty much a dead term now that isn't really used all that often. It is probably about time that we get away from roguelike, because roguelike and Doom clone might as well be the same sort of term. I think that roguelike is perhaps a less negative connotation. I feel that Doom clone initially was a negative connotation. I don't think you could ever say, oh, it's a clone of this. That's a really positive thing. No, that generally doesn't happen. But I think it does have to get to the point now where roguelike is such an established genre, and it didn't disappear in a few years like the term Doom clone did. So as a result, we really should be separating roguelike from the other stuff that uses ideas from that particular genre. We didn't start calling FPS titles that used RPG-style progression systems FPS RPGs, or indeed just RPGs. No, we called them FPS. And that is an aspect that's just been thrown in there. The thing is that it's become so commonplace, whereas you can very much still create platformers that do not have roguelike elements in them, that mentioning the RPG-style mechanics as part of the genre for those FPS games isn't relevant, but mentioning roguelike mechanics, whether it be procedural generation, whether it be permadeath, or something along those lines, is still relevant to the purchase decision. I don't think that calling them straight-up roguelikes is helpful. I don't think that calling something a roguelike platformer is particularly helpful, because all of the connotations attached to that, as you mentioned, are probably not involved in the game, and that creates a certain level of expectation that might not fully be met. I feel that roguelite is a great term that can be used alongside other more traditional genres like, say, RPG or platformer, to give an accurate description of what a game actually is. Because roguelike is such an established genre that has been around now for decades, I believe that it should remain sacrosanct and that we should not mess with it. We shouldn't be calling games that are clearly not roguelikes, because it's hijacking the term, and there's no need to hijack the term. It doesn't benefit anyone. In fact, it's a net negative. It sets expectations that may not be met, and it confuses consumers. You gotta bear in mind, though, I am the same guy that really loves metal subgenres, right? When I say Gothenburg-style melodic death metal, I'm saying that this is different to your regular melodic death metal, and so on and so forth. I feel that specific genres are very useful to the consumer, and that we shouldn't be generic in that regard. We should not be merging these genres together, and we certainly should not be so vague. It is not helpful to anybody. So I'm saying to you guys is quit hijacking the bloody term. God damn it. It already means something else. Quit it. Alright, folks, that's me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the Mailbox. You can email in mailbox at cynicalbrit.com with topics for future shows. This will be a show that is mixed in with the sale box alongside content patch where relevant. So that will be kind of the trio of newsy content that will be coming out on this channel. And eventually, I hope to get it back to 5 shows a week with a mixture of those 3. Here's hoping that news actually happens, because God knows it really isn't right now. I'll see you next time.